worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and it is broadcast number 499, June 28, 1981. Before I get too far along in the program, I want to announce a newsletter that is being put out by Jonathan Marshall. He's the associate editor for Inquiry magazine. And if you have a pencil, write this down. If not, you can write to me and get the information later when I'm off the air. Send it to P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922. And I'll give you this information if you want it and don't get it now. He has a newsletter going out called Parapolitics USA. The address is 747 Front Street, San Francisco, 94111. The cost is $25 a year, but I received several copies of the newsletter from Tom Davis up in Capitola and talked to Jonathan Marshall, and I think you're going to find a lot of information that complements the broadcast that I have on KLRB. He is covering various areas and articles of investigation and has categorized them, which is becoming more difficult for me to do every day as they overlap. But he is putting into various categories the pertinent articles that are appearing on those subjects, and he has about 40 or 50, 60 pages out already in just the first two issues. I think it's going to be well worth the $25 for those researchers that follow this seriously. He's broken up the categories of information into intelligence community, drugs and organized crime, exile, political activities, terrorism, the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, the Michael Sindona case, the CIA and banks, miscellaneous, and now he's into the Italian scandal, Propaganda Dewey, the Masonic scandal. The problem I'm having now is that every one of these categories is fitting together hand in glove and interweaving. The intelligence community, the CIA, the FBI, Navy intelligence are in fact being exposed every day in the newspapers with their dealings with drugs, narcotics, organized crime, and it's impossible to separate the intelligence community from the narcotics traffic. The exile groups such as the anti-Castro Cubans, the Nazis, the Ustashis, the Croatians, there are a great many of people of the exile group, the Laotians, the Vietnamese, that have become part of the CIA, Defense Department espionage activities that are into, indeed, narcotics traffic, working with the intelligence community. The bulk of the program this evening and for the next 3 or 4 weeks is going to be on the terrorism story, which is breaking, of course, in the news. Most papers had a section of the Seymour Hirsh articles in the New York Times. That was Sunday, June 14th and June 21st. He had two-part story on Edwin Wilson of the CIA and Frank Terpil, two of my favorite people, and I'm going to talk about those articles on terrorism, as I say, for the next few weeks, because I've made allegations that there has been no known terrorism in the various countries that wasn't funded by the Central Intelligence Agency or Navy or Defense Intelligence Agency. That goes for the Manson family. The SLA is the CIA. I wrote in 1974. The Italian Red Brigade, the Baader-Meinhof group, the Japanese Army, the PLO, the Palestinian group, the IRA, the headlines, and in the various articles coming out now is the admission that the Central Intelligence Agency funded the equipment for the bombs, the weapons. They supply the weapons, the training, the killing, teaching them to blow up planes and so forth, and that all the business about the violence coming from the left will have to be wiped off the slate clean, because terrorism, as it exists and is written about by the news media, is coming from, again, the intelligence community, the narcotics traffic, the exile group, and then the Nugan Hand that he puts in his category. The Nugan Hand Bank in Australia is now linked and has been for a while, but it was not known to me for many months, just learned it, that Mr. Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil and George Corcola, Navy intelligence, and the entire ball of wax of terrorism training Idi Amin and Gaddafi's group, as well as Carlos the Jackal, were behind the entire Nugan Hand operation in Australia. They're part and parcel of the same Navy intelligence cover to hide the CIA in case they got caught. And Michael Sindona is the member of organized crime who belongs to the Italian Nazi group who betrayed the Catholic Church by taking the money out of there and putting it into Nazi funds, combined with narcotics traffic and bank swindles running into hundreds of millions of dollars. He's now in a New York jail. The CIA and the banks, again, are mingled with the Nazis, the drug connections, the exile community, the terrorism, and you can't separate it. So that whatever categories he breaks down these subjects and has articles on them, you can overlay them if you follow these programs and put them into their proper place. His newsletters, the first ones that have come out, are very valuable, so you can write to Jonathan Marshall. Parapolitics is the title of his newsletter, 747 Front Street, San Francisco, 94111. Well, the New York Times had two large sections by Seymour Hirsh on this problem of terrorism, the CIA, Gaddafi, and international terrorism. But what Seymour Hirsh wrote about wasn't about Gaddafi at all. The title of the first story in the New York Times Magazine section on the 14th was The Gaddafi Connection. And underneath it says, a former CIA analyst publicly reveals the story behind a group of ex-CIA and military men who've been selling restricted material and their expertise for use by Libya terrorists. But as you read the article, it has no more to do with the title than you have to get a hold of it and copy it from the library if you don't have the New York Times Sunday edition yourself 2 weeks in a row. Translated, what Seymour Hirsh is saying in the entire article is that a CIA analyst whose father had the highest decorations in the CIA, there are 4 brothers in the CIA, realized what a foul operation it was. They were funding and training assassins for all those terrorist groups I mentioned. He met personally with Carlos the Jackal, who was responsible and claimed credit for killing the Jewish athletes in Munich in 1972, for blowing up Jews in Paris, in London, all over the world. Carlos was part of this operation, and they were also sending weapons to South Africa under the table, and at least 300,000 timers that blow up and explode and kill people, and guns with silencers shipped all over the world. This analyst went to the CIA and told them what was going on, and instead of their doing anything about it, and he went to the FBI and the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, he became hunted. He had to change his name. He had to go into hiding. He had to lose his identity. He pleaded with the agencies to stop it. And one of the proofs that it was and is still a CIA operation, and we'll go again into the motives of why they're doing it and how, is the fact that they have allowed it to continue, and only because certain murder cases are being investigated, such as the Judge Wood case in Texas, or the stealing of they describe as tons of material at China Lake for Gaddafi and military secrets, going to Libya and to Syria and all over the Middle East and Europe and to Carlos. In the investigation of particular murders in this country, a student at University of Colorado or Judge Wood, no matter where they're tapping, they're hitting this team. This is the assassination team, and I'll have a lot in the next few weeks and months to say, and I've done many broadcasts on them before. The important thing is that they're getting the New York Times and Jack Anderson and other newspaper articles at the present time, and very many of the murders that they tap, they're going to come right back to these assassination teams, going right down to John Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. In fact, Edwin Wilson, one of the parties involved, whose name runs through the Seymour Hirsh article, weaves in and out of it, was the man that supplied the material that blew up the car for Orlando Letelier on Embassy Row with Sandra Moffat, and our United States CIA supplied the machinery to overthrow and kill Allende and to kill his ambassador in Washington, D.C. This team have been supplying these weapons and the machinery to blow up people all over the world. They make simulated mountains and architecture that blows up fountain pens, dishes, lamps, traveling cases. They sent, as I say, to Gaddafi alone, the machinery to set up a factory for 300,000 pieces of murder equipment, an assassination factory. Then the CIA sent Green Berets over to train them. Now, all of this that I'm throwing out is absolutely scandalous, but I've been on the air 9 years, and I've done research for 17 years, And everything I've said was scandalous, and I never could figure out why more people weren't outraged at the bits and pieces that I was picking up day by day. But now finally we have the New York Times and other newspaper people writing about this. The second article Seymour Hirsh did is a continuation of the Gaddafi story, but as I said before, it isn't about the Gaddafi connections. It's about the CIA. It's about actions that took place with the approval of the CIA, with the Pentagon, and the very man who blew the whistle, this Kevin McCullough, he was on television this week, was forced to go into hiding as if he were the criminal, even though he's describing the silencers, the assassination weapons, the violence that was approved, condoned, and while he worked for them, he thought that it was always a CIA operation, and it turns out it actually is, and it always was, and that the necessity to arm the appearance of the left, the terrorism, will fade away each day. As you read headlines, there was one this week, the PLO phalangelists each say the others training Nazis, and this goes back to Beirut and the PLO and the training of Nazi terrorism to send around the world. The people that you thought were left or associated with Russia, such as Gaddafi or the PLO, have been very closely linked to the Nazi movement. Now, just this week, Gaddafi said that he may line up with the Soviet Union, he may strengthen the Soviet ties. Why? Partly because the ship is sinking and the rats are leaving it. And Gaddafi, everything he paid for was supplied to him by our CIA. Everything he did, the killers that did the 11 or 12 murders that he's charged with, were trained by the CIA. People like Frank Terpil would promise an opponent or a man running against Gaddafi that Gaddafi didn't like, who lived in Egypt. Terpil was hired to do the security for the man's house. And at the same time as earning a salary to do the security, he brought in the anti-Castro Cubans trained by our CIA to murder the man. So he gets money for killing him on the one hand, he got the money from him for putting security into his house. And those are the kind of dogs that our government, through our tax dollars and through the press, allowing this to accumulate and pile up, these are the kind of people that I've been talking about for a long time and are now getting more exposed in the news. Now, we kicked out some of the people of Gaddafi's Libyan group in Washington and closed the embassies because we said there were so many murders and they were so violent. And now they're saying, well, we may move to the Soviet Union because they know that all the violence, as I said, was provided for them. The training for Idi Amin and for Gaddafi, for Carlos, was United States people from the Navy and Marines and the Berets and the CIA Defense Intelligence Agency. We supplied the weapons from California, from Colorado, from Virginia, from Pennsylvania, from Georgia, from Mitchell Ward Bell. We supplied the silencers, the guns, the training. And then when we go to investigate a murder and we find, oh, that Gaddafi's behind it and they're blaming him, he is saying, wait a minute, it's not me. And then a man who worked with him says, wait, it's not me either. And he says, finally, I can't go to any agency in the federal government and tell them what's going on. I'll go to a journalist. And he goes to Seymour Hirsh, who broke the My Lai story years ago, and that's how the story began to unfold. And then others get on the bandwagon with the bits and pieces. Now, Seymour Hirsh has some interesting information. His articles are packed with information, but there's something very strange lacking in his articles, and I just have spent hours, about 20 hours this week, just outlining and retyping one segment of the New York Times Sunday section into about 40 typewritten pages to get familiarity with the dates and the names and the meeting places that are just in this one single article. But the article that he writes about has to do with Frank Terpil and Edwin Wilson. He goes into their biography. He gives a lot of information about them. And I might say that on KLRB last July, it's almost a year ago, I was analyzing the most important stories of the past 2 years that had taken place up to July of last year, from 1978 to 80. And number one on that sheet, and you can order that's in quarter or self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you a sheet from that broadcast. The most important news story of all was the past tapes and broadcasts I had done on Frank Edward Terpil in Washington, D.C., and George Gregory Corcola, because I said these are the assassination teams used by the government. They worked with the CIA. They were presently in Libya, and that was the #1 story. And then I listed 7 other news stories, 8 other stories that were of utmost importance, and every single one of those 8 taps into the Terpil-Corcola assassination team stories that had to do with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the Jonestown, the setting up of Jonestown and the murder of Leo Ryan, Colonial Dignidad on the border of Chile and Argentina, the Abscam Brylab case with the indictment of Carlos Marcello and Irv Davidson, the murder of Pope John Paul I and the relationship of John Paul II to organized crime and Nazis, Auschwitz, and the Hitler agents, the murder of Nelson Rockefeller to make way for Ronald Reagan with the South African California connections to his murder, the murder of John Paisley, which tapped directly into the Nugan Hand Bank, which goes back to Terpil and Corcola. I'm throwing out a lot of names, and also that evening, a year ago, I talked about Joseph Mengele, the American citizen, who was a citizen before he was at Auschwitz doing the experimentations, and how he was protected by the FBI and the United States government. Now, every one of those items that I summarized 1 year ago, if you put a circle around where you put the CIA and Navy intelligence, and you listed those with spokes, each one of them would interweave like a spider web because they're all one ball of wax. And what they consist of are scandalous episodes in which murders took place for the sole purpose of gaining control of specific governments, creating military coups, killing labor leaders, newspaper publishers, creating banks where they could fund right-wing Nazi organizations through narcotics traffic and rebuild the Nazis in almost every single country in the world. That's why the groups that you think were radical towards the Soviets, like the Palestinian groups or the so-called third world countries, are very well trained with Nazi experts in their police departments and privately wearing armbands and swastikas. The headquarters have been down in Argentina, in Chile, and in Spain. This Licio Gelli has fled Italy. He's still in hiding, probably down in South America when the Italian scandal broke. The Italian government changed hands this last week for the first time in 41 years. The Italian Christian Democratic Party is out. The French have gone socialist. Margaret Thatcher is in trouble today. The Germans, 1 million of them, signed a petition to get NATO and American missiles out of Germany. Turkey has said, we don't want NATO bases. We don't want to be responsible for you landing on our shores for the Persian Gulf problems. The Soviet Union is making overtures to Saudi Arabia, the Soviet Union. China said that George Bush and Alexander Haig have overreacted to the Soviet system. They don't think it's that much of a threat to them. And one by one, the countries are flaking off. They're watching these scandals evolve in every single country. Just about has had a coup and has had people murdered that can be directly linked to this modus operandi known as the American intelligence establishment. When Ronald Reagan became president with his bravado and his anti-Russian speeches as if he was ready to go to war the next day, and when Alexander Haig followed up with his speeches, the people around the world, our allies, pulled back, at least that they were going to rechange their thinking and try for treason. Many, many people and the top NATO officials have resigned, lost their security clearances, and so forth. There is too much that is tainted. There's too many hundreds of millions of dollars missing from various banks. I've run those down before. 50 million out of Berlin, several 300 million the Wells Fargo, 55 million Nugan Hand. It goes on and on. It adds up to billions of dollars. The banks can't be investigated without tapping into these sources, and therefore it's interesting now, at this time, when there is nowhere else to go, that Seymour Hirsh and the New York Times and Jack Anderson begin to push away again at these articles on Terpil and Edwin Wilson. But they're very silent about Corcola, and he is the bottom line. He is the guy from New Jersey who works heavily with Samuel Cummings of the CIA in London, provides weapons, sets up assassination teams, sets up the anti-Castro Cubans, and is responsible for murders all over the world. George is missing. George Corcola is missing. Michael Sindona wants to talk, and they're going to make a movie about Frank Terpil in London. Maxine Cheshire, one of my favorite writers, had an article this week. Frank Terpil may be in a starring role in London. He is in hiding, and he's going to talk about the CIA and how he's an international arms merchant for the CIA. And according to her in the Washington Post, the documents that he has are going to embarrass the agency if nothing else. Now, he's pulled in to help make a movie called The Terpil Story, a group of people that made the movie about Saudi Arabia called Death of a Princess. And Jim Hogan, the writer, Hougan, who is a fantastic writer and researcher, is going to help Terpil in London, according to Maxine Cheshire. She said that Washington author Jim Hogan, the bureau chief from Harper's Magazine, who wrote the best-selling book Spooks, which I've mentioned many times in this program, that book is almost a textbook source on the subject of spies for hire, is supposed to be one of the few people in the world trusted by Frank Terpil, and he may make a brief visit to take time off from his book on Watergate to be a coordinator consultant to a movie on Frank Terpil. Well, that should have a few people nervous, because when they start making documentary movies about Frank Terpil, look out. Things are going to fall in bits and pieces. There won't be any big headlines saying, oh, yes, we killed this person or we killed that person. But there are individual books and articles and pieces of news just flooding the media right now. I say flooding, I mean like on Section D, a little column, maybe 1-inch column. But it's significant that it's covered at all, and the fact that certain actions are taking place means that they're more nervous every day. For example, I mentioned last week on the program about the Dominica invasion that failed, the use of the Nazi, the Klan, the subpoena that was put down to call John Connolly and the representative from Texas. Well, one of the men who put up money for this operation, an attorney from Memphis, Tennessee, was shot in the mouth. I think I talked about last Sunday night on the broadcast. And 2 days later, there was a little article in the San Jose News. Well, I'm sure all of you know the San Jose News. It wasn't even the San Jose Mercury. It's an evening edition of a little paper that really doesn't get out even by subscription. You hardly see it. And in Section D on page 19, there's a 1-inch column. The attorney who put up $30,000 towards this invasion, which involved drug smuggling, millions of dollars, the highest echelon of intelligence, Canada, United States, leaders of the fascist organizations with Nazi flags. One of the attorneys, no less, not one of the little schleppers that goes along, was shot through the mouth 2 days after his name was mentioned as putting up money in the court. The court was case going on in Louisiana, and he lives in Arkansas, was shot in the mouth. Well, so much for that. Now, I want to just briefly run down a little bit before I get into the New York Times article on these operations that Seymour Hirsh did. Some of the material I did a while back on broadcast that I've given you the numbers up about these men. Their names first broke in the news in January 1980, and that was about a year and a half ago, with headlines, 10,000 guns seized, 2 people arrested, $2 million machine gun sale. That was the New York Times. The day before Christmas, these stories broke. Ex-CIA agent held in $2.5 million arms deal. And it goes into gun runners arrested in New York City at the Hilton Hotel for gun running. There were several 5 or 6 headlines on this subject, and the summary of the first 6 articles that came out were that Frank Terpil, a CIA agent in 1971, had set up headquarters in Paris, and it had an office in Washington, D.C. called Oceanic Corporation, that he used safe houses in London and Paris, Panama, New Jersey, and Washington that belonged to the CIA, that they supplied weapons and guns for specifically assassinations, and that's the area I study, particularly the killing of people, why they're killed, particularly candidates, the president or a candidate for presidency or a senator or a newspaper person or prominent people such as John Lennon. these men were arrested, and the first article said that they supplied machine guns, .22 rifles for assassinations, equipped with silencers, poison darts, briefcase bombs, letter bombs, hand grenades, booby traps, millions of dollars of rifles, machine guns, manufactured in Britain, and they were trained assassination teams by the CIA. Now, that broke a year and a half ago. They had a corporation George Corcola had called Amstec Corporation in New Jersey, an electronic firm. And this equipped Scotland Yard, Exxon Oil, Mobil Oil, and George Corcola was arrested, and he fled the country with Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil. The bail was reduced to nothing. George Corcola headed Amstec, and the two men worked for major corporations that had been fronts for espionage. They were obviously high-level assassins, and they obtained their silencers from Mitchell Werbel, who's written up in the book Spooks by Hogan at great length. And the first articles talked about their setting up the murder in the Olympic Games for the athletes, the 11 Israeli athletes. They admitted they had set that up. Terpil had moved to Paris, and they had set up killings in Paris of other prominent people. And the first article said they were all CIA connected, and they had funds that got them along with the local police and various people that they could escape ever being arrested. Now, I never read in any Jewish magazines or any Jewish groups that they weren't outraged that the CIA, with people working with Scotland Yard and the CIA, admitted killing these Jewish athletes in Munich and many more other Jews, and attempted murders in London and on the continent of Europe and the Middle East. But the first articles also linked them to the anti-Castro Cubans, which goes back to the Kennedy assassination in the Bay of Pigs, to the Korean Reverend Moon, who my research has linked to Hitler's money in Asia, to Idi Amin and his assassination squads, to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, to Libya, and international terrorism. Now that, I'm reading to you, is just from a sheet that I did a year and a half ago on KLRB on these characters a year and a half ago. And as I say, now it's breaking in what we call the establishment media. These individual stories broke in Washington Post, New York Times, but then they were shut up for a year and a half as if you could hide all of this. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article in January 1980, a year and a half ago, The Arms Dealer Who Talks Too Much. That's Frank Terpil from McLean, Virginia, who worked for the Navy, the Army, a cryptographic code breaker, using silencers and weapons, from Mitchell Werbel from Powder Springs, Georgia. Frank Werbel said, Frank worked for us. His dealings were approved of by the State Department, by the Office of Munitions Control. Terpil and Corcola's clients, according to the San Francisco article, were the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Federal Aviation. And I asked at the time if Dorothy Hunt's plane crashes at the height of Watergate and they are doing investigative work for Federal Aviation, that could be very cozy. Or, as I mentioned before, the security service that Frank Terpil gives for a man in Egypt, and Gaddafi wants him murdered, so they send in their anti-Castro Cubans to murder him while they're supposed to be making the house secure. So I was bringing up, this was in January 1980, I was talking about these characters on the air. I was talking about the attorney for Frank Terpil in New York City when they were arrested was James LaRosa, who's also the attorney for the Esposito racetrack ties. There was a big scandal in New York City about Meade Esposito, who's the head of the Brooklyn Democratic Party, who's the advisor to presidents, to governors, to mayors, who was involved in an $18 million scandal relating to a Catholic order in New York City, who had money given to a co-worker of his, Representative Richard Hanna in California, who was linked to Tan Sung Park and the Korean CIA. So this can of worms of organized crime, presidents, advisors, governors, mayors, the Catholic group, lawyers in common with Terpil and Corcola, was in the news a year and a half ago before it began to break again this week. And as I said, past weeks. And the reason it's breaking now is that everything the Justice Department investigates, or the FBI, they're going to tap back into this operation. It's vast, and it is never ending, and at some point the cords have to be cut. We'll take a 1-minute break and then get back to these characters and do a little bit more about the Seymour Hirsh article this week in the Times.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
International.
Okay. One of the points I want to make is that in January 1980, on the various radio stations that play these tapes, I was also giving references to that book called Carlos, The Portrait of a Terrorist by Colin Smith, published by Holt Reinhardt in 1976. And this book describes Carlos the Jackal operating in Europe and the Middle East. He's a terrorist assassin, that he shot Edward Seif, the British Zionist, in London in 1973, that he organized the Japanese Red Army's assault on the French embassy. He had launched a rocket attack at the LL Jet Airport, Orly Airport in Paris, killed 2 French police and an Arab informer in Paris, kidnapped 11 oil ministers in Vienna in 1975, and I went on and on with the kinds of things that Carlos was doing and linking them to the Terpil, Corcola, Wilson connections and the CIA. Well, this week there was an article in the Washington Post, June 22nd, 1981, report links 2 ex-CIA agents to the theft of military radar, and that has to do with the China Lake operation and the tons of stuff that was stolen by Terpil and Wilson and sent via the CIA to Gaddafi. And then it goes on, the Washington Post story, to say Terpil and Wilson have been accused in indictments of hiring former Green Berets to work in Libya, where they trained members of the international terrorist groups, including Italy's Red Brigade, the PLO, and the Irish Republican Army. So in trying to find out where our equipment is going from China Lake, or if you want to find out who shot Judge Wood in Texas, or you want to solve a lot of problems, you're going to tap back to what we were told all along were the great leftist third world terrorists who are nothing but a large operation of the CIA. Well, why does the CIA go to so much trouble? Why does Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig and the State Department and the Office of the CIA, Richard Helms, Alan Dulles before him, John McCone, William Colby, George Bush, why do they have to go to all this trouble? Well, one of the things they have to do in case they come close to losing an election, and they want to keep a powerful control on the government, is that they have to have an excuse to take power at any moment. The difference between fascism and the democratic system is allegedly the elections, even though the candidates are murdered as they get their way up, or when they're running for office at the time of the primary, or if they're even in office like John Kennedy, or want to be president like Nelson Rockefeller. George Wallace is shot. There are ways to keep certain people from ever getting that seat in the White House, and there are ways to control the major population if they get too uppity or catch on. And one of the ways was to create this terror that looked like it came from the left, so that men like Alexander Haig in a crisis could say it was the left doing these operations, and like he wanted command of the emergency unit in case of crisis at home domestically. He had a big conflict with Bush just a few days before Ronald Reagan was shot. Ronald Reagan used terrorism and fear to get a police state, to get an intercommunication FBI system, to get data banks when he was governor for 8 years. He used a network of mind control experiments at UCLA that he was pushing, the electrode implants, the mass murders up in California and Santa Cruz area, the Zebra, the Zodiac, all of these operations, Chowchilla, all had integral links to California violence that from time to time in the past 9 years I've tried to explain at a slower pace. But this makes superstars out of the district attorneys, out of the prosecuting attorneys, the defense attorneys, and there's a lot of big bucks in promulgating this fear of people, the uncertainty, and selling stories and superstars such as Charles Manson, keeping the real killer like Charles Watson, a priest down in San Luis Obispo. But we have these superstars always up for new hearings, Sarah Jane Moore and Squeaky Fromm, and it goes on and on. There is a whole academy of people, David Berkowitz, and many of these mass murders that are contrived. They're experimentations, just as Joan handles an experimentation project. And they are run for the purpose of control of the population if they have to have control. The same principle that was used by Adolf Hitler at the time of the Reichstag. Hitler wasn't going to be popular. He was going to do things that the masses didn't like. He won in an election. As soon as the 1933 election was over, he was going to do some terrible things. And the only way he could round up his opponents, or the newspaper publishers, or the professors at the universities, was to have somebody burn his Reichstag, the government building, and say that the left did it, and then round up those people that he thought would oppose future policies. But in order to do that, you have to create the left, and you make these student riots, and the Isla Vista, that was a provocation, or various demonstrations during the anti-war movement that were brought in by the right. And the most violent people at the demonstrations were paid agent provocateurs, and many of them surfaced, many wrote books, many told about their experiences. They were necessary to act badly so that the newspapers could tell you how bad the anti-war people were, how bad the peace people were, how bad the critics of the government were, how terrible they acted. That's what the Tom Charles Houston plan was about. That's what the COINTEL program was about, was to infiltrate, to bring violence, to discredit, to break up marriages, to send letters home, to bring bombs into buildings, to encourage burning draft cards. It's necessary. The power structure thought, and it wasn't necessary at all, the power structure thought it was necessary to do all this, but it wasn't. Carlos, I understand, the jackal was down in Venezuela and was shot last week, but I'm sure he's alive or has left diaries around of where he is. But now we have a whole army of people who've done illegal acts who are willing to talk. The Frank Terpils, the Michael Hands, the Michelle Sindonas. You can multiply that about 300 times, and if any one of those 300 people talks, then the system begins to fall apart. Now, that's what happened when a former CIA man went to Seymour Hirsh to tell the story about the operations and the legal activity that was going on because he couldn't stand it anymore. Kevin I can't pronounce his name very well, but I'm not sure, McCulloughy, I guess that's the way he pronounces it, Kevin P. McCulloughy, went to the news media and for 5 years ago, not last week. Seymour Hirsch's article just came out 2 weeks ago, and last week, for 5 years, he's tried to call a halt to this kind of insanity and explain what was going on. Now, Jack Anderson had several articles this week on spreading terrorism, and he begins his columns by saying, international terrorism has been proclaimed the #1 target of the Reagan administration, yet our own clandestine services may have contributed to the spread of terrorism. And he refers to Ed Wilson and Frank Terpil and the funding of Idi Amin and Libya's Gaddafi. And he goes into various theft ring at China Lake that when they began to investigate, it goes into their operation of Terpil and Wilson. Investigations of the FBI and the CIA tap into their activities. Various murders, payoffs of the Energy Department, the attempted murder of that student in Colorado. Everywhere they go, they're finding these guys. And they've been active, and they've gotten away with a lot. And then Jack Anderson said it is time that either the administration or Congress mounted a concentrated attack on the continuing machinations of Ed Wilson and Frank Terpil. Their activities, and particularly their buddy-buddy relationship with U.S. officials, are an embarrassment to the United States and should be exposed to the world. Well, he is right. They are an embarrassment. Entire nations are changing their affiliations. You heard what Mitterrand said to Bush. He wasn't going to sing to his tune, and he didn't care what he thought in the appointment of 4 communists into a NATO or a country that works with the Western world for the first time since World War II. Old Marshall with the Marshall Plan would flip in his grave if he saw that and saw the Italian government throw out the Western orders, the power of Henry Luce and John Connolly and William Colby, ordering the Vatican, ordering Italy. who should be in power. And then with one fell swoop, the scandal stinks so high that they're all out. Yes, it is an embarrassment, but the only way it's going to be solved, and Jack Anderson is childish, and he knows it because he works with these guys too. The only way it is going to be solved is the way I mentioned last week and for the last 4 or 5 weeks. It's going to take about 300 people who should be identified. And as I said before, I could make a list if I stayed up all night. I'd give you the names of 300 people who should be removed from any decision-making in the government at all. Clark Clifford, John J. McCloy, John Connolly, George Bush. They should be taken out, and a whole new team of younger people, lawyers with no affiliations to murders, to swollen bank accounts, to missing millions, to covering up being on the Warren Commission, such as Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, these slimy crooks that we have produced, these Lyndon Johnson, Nixon types of people are so terrible. They should never have been president in the first place, but none of their team, none of their cabinets or staffs, Robert McNamara, the whole gang should be out. All the intelligence community that was set up by Reinhard Gehlen and Alan Dulles, and new people with a mind of what the world is really like, without having to murder, without having to steal and extortion and blackmail, and so should be put into power. Well, that's not going to happen, so Jack Anderson says it's an embarrassment to the United States. If what I'm reading in the daily papers is true, it's worse than an embarrassment. It's an absolute scandal, but it is men like Anderson also who sat on it all these years. I've been doing the research on the Kennedy assassination for 17 years, and I've corresponded with Anderson. I've talked to him on the phone. He has been a scandalous person to cover up. The Dorothy Hunt plane crash, the shooting of Wallace, the murder of Mary Jo Kopechne, the murder of Robert Kennedy, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He only writes a column when it's come out anyway. If I have something on the air a year later, he has a column on it because he knows it's going to come anyway, and then he gets in on the team. But he doesn't explain how he missed the boat a year and a half ago. So if he thinks that the Reagan administration that is part and parcel of this is going to come clean, forget it. I think that Reagan is going to be out because of the Michael Sindona Italian scandal linked to John Connolly and the Republican Party. I don't see how he can weather this scandal that's coming down in every country. I personally believe that he'll be out, and so will Alexander Haig. As a matter of fact, the Council of Foreign Relations had an election this week for their board, and for the first time in years, Henry Kissinger was left off the board. And David Rockefeller was furious. Here's the Grand Master of Spying, who's linked to the Nugan Hand Bank, to Terpil, Corcola, and the whole gang. And they put Cyrus Vance on. Now, Vance resigned from the State Department at the time that Carter was going to have that escape attempt of the hostages because he knew it would fail and it could possibly lead to World War III right there. And he didn't want that excuse and the power of Brzezinski and the group that were nudging this on. And he went on down to Florida and resigned. Well, it's interesting that even the reactionary old Wall Street moneybags didn't vote Kissinger on the board. There were 2 men on the board that offered to resign to give him their seat, and the group that elected said, no way, no more Henry Kissinger. And the next that will fall will be Haig and then Connolly, and they will slide as these stories break. And as I say, there isn't a day that I don't see them breaking. Now, in essence, I'm going to give you the summary of the Seymour Hirsh article of the first segment, and then I'll go into detail and explain some of it next week, and then I'll do the second segment and update you on a few of the news events. These are the links to the CIA. Even though he says they're former CIA, you have to put the chronology into space. He's talking about men that started working in 1971, 72. At the time of Watergate, you saw that James McCord, the former CIA man, had McCord Associates, a private firm. It was 100% CIA. E. Howard Hunt retired from the CIA in 1971. He worked at Mullen Associates. He sat in the White House with State Department papers, $100 a day for the CIA. G. Gordon Liddy, at the time of Watergate, worked for the Treasury Department, the FBI, and the CIA. Mr. Martinez and Gonzalez and Bernard Barker, brought up from Miami, were in fact working for the CIA. There was no ex-CIA in Watergate, even though the first stories of those guys were CIA. Now, in summary, Seymour Hirsh describes the Green Berets, the special forces that we trained in Southeast Asia that are in factories making assassination weapons with the CIA for Gaddafi in Libya. Now, this article is just about Gaddafi, but Frank Terpil has companies in 100 different places. We're only talking about Libya now and the links to Carlos. The article talks about Kevin McCullough, the CIA partner of Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil, and as I said before, his father secretly got the highest award the CIA ever gave, and he has 4 brothers in the CIA. He was described as an altar boy, an Eagle Scout, the varsity basketball team. He's a father, his children. He started working in 1963 full-time for the CIA, the year that John Kennedy was murdered. He was an airborne radio operator. He worked in the Navy communications and had highly classified programs for the CIA. And in 1968 was in the electronics industry. In 1975, he started working with Edwin Wilson of the CIA. The CIA explosives were made in factories in Virginia and in Pennsylvania and in California. Specifically, CIA divisions were hired to make the explosives, to send over to the Nazi training camps and the PLO, and to arm the Red Brigade, the Red Army of Japan, the Baader-Meinhof, and the IRA. This is all in the New York Times article. The CIA assisted Gaddafi in at least 10 murders, including that one I mentioned in Colorado, the attempted murder where a Green Beret agent, Mr. Tafoya, was to murder a student, a Libyan student at Colorado. In investigating that, they tapped into the Coca-Cola operation. The CIA agents, these particular men, transferred the technical knowledge from the CIA under the table to these countries that were listed: Chile, South Korea, Brazil, Argentina, Taiwan, South Africa, Iraq, and Pakistan. Not a third world country, and maybe you saw the paper this morning. South Korea said to North Korea, I'm going to blow you, I can blow you off the earth. We're going to drop an atomic bomb. That was the morning, you open the morning paper. We're going to blast you off the earth. Those weapons were made in Washington, D.C., and in Texas and in California. The CIA weapons that were used specifically for anti-Semitic attacks, for killing Jews, for Jewish bombings, and Carlos and his gang were very active in anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish attacks, and one of the purposes of the CIA training the PLO and the Nazi headquarters is for future attacks upon the Jews in Israel. CIA profited and made money from the Libya invasion of Chad. They made a large amount of money, and all the time we're yelling that the Soviet Union is in Afghanistan. Edwin Wilson, there's a long biography of him that I broke down in Seymour Hirsch's article. In essence, Edwin Wilson was in the CIA and Navy intelligence. He owns a 1,500-acre farm in Virginia since 1975, right next door to Senator John Warner, former Secretary of the Navy. It's an interesting aspect I'll go into later at length, because the man who won the seat for the Senate in the primaries was Mr. Obashan, who was blown up in an airplane crash with the same kind of instruments that Wilson from CIA and Navy intelligence was using to kill Letelier and Sandra Moffat and shipping to Gaddafi over in Libya. So the man who had the factories, the instruments to blow up and detonate and murder an assassin was living next door to his boss from Navy intelligence. One was in Navy intelligence, and John Warner was Secretary of the Navy and wanted to be a senator. And his opponent, Mr. Obashan, was blown up in an airplane. It crashed, and then John Warner got his seat. That's his next-door neighbor. There's a very pretty color picture in the magazine section of their beautiful estates next to each other. Edwin Wilson was active in the Bay of Pigs. He was a contract agent. He paid and he hired, which means he worked with Richard Nixon, who was the organizer of that, and E. Howard Hunt and Bernard Barker, and the whole Watergate gang, Martinez, and the whole gang from the Kennedy assassination up to Watergate. He was active in the Bay of Pigs. In 1970 to 75, according to Seymour Hirsch, he was working for Navy intelligence, and he was supplying agents, sneaking them from Taiwan to the mainland of China, at this time from 70-75 and worked for the Navy. Now, those are the years, according to another newspaper, the National Times, an article by Brian Toohey that came out in October 80, that Mr. Edwin Wilson was setting up and working with the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, which I've said was the assassination team, the secret team for murders all over the world with CIA money and narcotics traffic. So while he was working with the Taiwan agents, he was also active in the Nugan Hand Bank with the people from the Phoenix program that settled from Vietnam, the assassination teams. He opened up an office called Consultant Engineer in Washington, which was an import-export business, but was the front, again, for Nugan Hand, for smuggling agents into China. And then he asked Kevin McCulloughy of the CIA family into his Washington office in 1976. That's the year that George Bush was director of the CIA. Kevin McCulloughy was from that CIA family. He was to work with Edwin Wilson with a long history of the CIA, and they were to work for George Bush, now our vice president, who was director of the CIA, 1976 to 77. And they opened up an office called Intertechnology Incorporated. And at that point, they brought in Frank Terpil, and Intertechnology's first job was to send weapons to Zambia, machine guns, silencers, murder weapons, specifically used to kill, but the silencers would conceal who did the killing. Then Mr. Wilson, Edwin Wilson, living next door to his buddy, John Warner, in Virginia, had strong contacts with Strom Thurmond. Now, Thurmond's an interesting character. He's the one who has the House Internal Committee on Terrorism. I wonder how he's going to handle the New York Times articles about his buddy. Thurmond is the man that wanted to deport John Lennon, who I accuse of being behind the assassination of Lennon. And Terpil, Corcola, and Wilson, this assassination team, were thick in Beirut, Lebanon, where David Chapman was sent, I said, for his training and his mind control. They were thick with the Fort Chaffee, Arkansas group, where the Laotian CIA people were brought and the Vietnamese CIA. And then Chapman was sent to Hawaii, where I said the Nugan Hand Bank had headquarters for assassination teams. And you're going to find within the next 1 to 2 years, not very long, that Mark David Chapman worked for Edwin Wilson, Frank Terpil, Strom Thurmond, and the whole gang, and they had decided a long time ago that if Lennon ever appeared, he would be killed, and Chapman would be the man to do it. He will fit right into this slot. Now, in May of '76, when they opened the offices of Intertechnology, they brought in Theodore Shackley, Ted Shackley, who was the assistant to the deputy director of clandestine operations, the most powerful post in the CIA. Theodore Shackley's operation was the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. Theodore Shackley was station chief of the CIA in Laos. He was the station chief in Vietnam. He worked with the Phoenix assassination programs, and he moved to Chile to take care of Allende and that government and their operation. Also, as I said, Wilson and that gang blew up Letelier in Washington later. Now, these people have been in the CIA since long before the Bay of Pigs in '51. They were operating together in the Bay of Pigs. They worked with Allen Dulles and Reinhard Gehlen. This team are the assassination team. They are the interconnecting links that link to John Tower of Texas, who was corresponding with Lee and Marina Oswald, who brought them to this country. He's the brother-in-law of Samuel Cummings in London, who was supplying the weapons and the silencers for Terpil, Wilson, Corcola, wherever the killings went. In order to get the office going to send the equipment to Libya, the 300,000 pieces of equipment for bombing, imagine how many people Gaddafi could blow up or kill with 300,000 timers just for one operation. This is all Seymour Hirsh is right about, that one group. They had to get special TNT and chemicals to go on commercial airlines and put them in illegally as prescriptions. They changed the box labels. They sent them to Dulles Airport. Stuff that could have been blown up, the Lufthansa pilots refused to take it. Any airplane could have been blown up if it hit an air pocket with commercial people. Now, Theodore Shackley, one of the highest men of the CIA, the deputy director for clandestine operations, sat with Wilson, Edwin Wilson, and Terpil and other people, and went to the offices of the CIA to make sure that these men got the equipment to fill the order for Gaddafi. the deputy director for the clandestine operations. Wilson had worked at the Bay of Pigs with Shackley. They'd worked at Nugan Hand in Australia and had done a lot of clandestine work. Now, at the home of Mr. Shackley that evening where they all met was a Harry Rastatter. He just came home from being with the Shah of Iran. He worked with the Sabak, the CIA torture teams. And he was setting up U.S. intelligence in Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and Libya. So they arranged for Frank Terpil, to go to Libya, and the CIA paid for that, and Edwin Wilson. Now, the company that was to set up the electronics equipment for Gaddafi, the first company was a CIA company that manufactured the equipment to blow people away for good. It's called the American Electronics Laboratory in Colmar, Pennsylvania, and they have a branch in Falls Church, Virginia. And that's where they went to get the timers to send to Gaddafi and information and classified electronic equipment and gear. Now, it's obvious that in this 1 hour, I'm not going to get even to begin with the Seymour Hirsh article of the links of the CIA to this operation, and I will continue for another few minutes on it. But I want to summarize what I've said so far so that it's clear for the weeks to come. I have been on the air 9 years. This is starting my 10th year this past week or so. I have published articles, and I have made very strong allegations that there are teams that were set up immediately after World War II that brought in the chief of Hitler's intelligence, that settled around the world and in Washington, D.C., that set up our CIA, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, with the means to overthrow governments, to kill people, to assassinate whenever necessary. And this illegality has been going on since 1945. The arrangements were made starting in 1943, as soon as Hitler lost his battle against Russia and saw the handwriting was on the walls, that they would retrench. The best book I have on that is by a man named Rees, called The Nazis Go Underground. The meeting in May of 1943 of taking the money, the art, the forged money, the Swiss bank accounts, putting it in Evita Peron's bank, and then unleashing it when John J. McCloy, he was the chairman of Chase Manhattan, he was on the Warren Commission, he had released the top Nazis such as Hallmark, the bankers, Hitler's bankers. Now, the Nazis aren't fun and games. They killed to get to power, and they've killed. The CIA has condoned it. We have allowed these people, through our agencies, to do these things. And because the country can't support any longer this total illegality, some of the system's methods are falling apart. After all, you had John Hinckley Jr., a member of the Nazi Party throughout the United States, at many states, almost killing the President of the United States, Mehmet Ali Agca, a Nazi linked to the Damascus, Syria, Austria, German, French, Swiss, Italian, Spanish Nazis, shooting the Pope, and he's still not through. He has infections. You have a man like McCullough talking to the New York Times, people like Terpil ready to talk. The system is getting unglued. It's good. It's long overdue. And each week we'll follow more. I'll go back to the Seymour Hirsh articles next week because we don't have time. But in essence, what I've been saying week after week is coming apart now, and I'll be able to illustrate through things that I've said in the past what is in the news now, so that you can see how it happened and how it was covered up, and you'll know what to expect as these other people start to talk. In the meantime, get the 2 New York Times articles, the magazine section, and copy them of June 14th and 21st, because the excerpts that were in the local papers hardly covered it. Every newspaper had a little bit of it, maybe 1 or 2 pages, but not the whole thing. And the whole thing is just a fraction of the real story. We'll get back to this next week. Terribly important and very exciting that it's finally coming unglued. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
Faster than the Pony Express, they came a-playing out of the west. They didn't need no telephone poles, 'cause they rode the radio. We always called them the wireless kids, but there was another handle they used to hit. KLRB Carmel, they'd say. Come on over for a spell today.